All right, everybody. I want to welcome you back to this episode of Zoom Goes to History. I'm Kris White with the American Battlefield Trust. I'm the education manager for the American Battlefield Trust, and we are talking today some Revolutionary War history. We haven't done one yet. Zoom Goes to History about the Revolutionary War. We'll bring you two of them today. This one will be about the Siege of Yorktown, which took place in 1781, and for many people was the end of the American Revolution. Kind of like Appomattox is the end of the American Civil War for a lot of people. So what we'll talk about today with Mark Malloy, who is from Emerging Revolutionary War, as well as an author on many topics, Rev War. We have Adam Zielinski. Adam is one of our contractors at the American Battlefield Trust. You might see some of his articles talking about various topics of the American Revolution on our website at battlefields.org. We have Phil Greenwalt. Phil is the co-founder of Emerging Revolutionary War, and we have Dan Davis, who is education associate at the American Battlefield Trust. So, gentlemen, good afternoon.
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 Right. So what I want to do is bring us out, as I like to do, 50,000 feet, and talk a little bit about what the situation is in 1780, early 1781 for both the British and the Americans, and even the French, because we'll be talking about the French here on Zoom Goes to History today. So what we want to do is talk a minute about where these armies stand. You know, there's two different theaters to the American Revolution. We have the Northern Theater and the Southern Theater. And Dan, I want to kick it over to you here in a second and talk about the Southern Theater, where many people think it is the decisive theater of the American Revolution. You know, where we have the battles at places like Kings Mountain, Camden, Guilford Courthouse, and how that's going to bring the armies up from the South and bring some of the armies up from the South there. And then we'll talk about George Washington and Rochambeau and how they'll come down from the North, and what George Washington's focus was. So the Siege of Yorktown will take place September and October of 1781. But to get there, Dan, let's start off with the American Revolution in the Southern Theater.
Sure. In the summer and fall of 1780, Lord Charles Cornwallis is leading a British army through South Carolina. The British have captured Charleston in May. Cornwallis has defeated the American army in the South at the Battle of Camden in August. But the tide begins to turn. At the Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1780, Cornwallis is going to lose an entire loyalist army to what we know to American Patriot Whig militia. We know them today as the Over Mountain Men. Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief in North America, said that Kings Mountain was the first link in the chain of events that eventually led to the British losing North America. The campaign is going to continue into the new year of 1781, and Cornwallis is going to be dealt another defeat. A wing of his army, commanded by Banastre Tarleton, is going to be nearly destroyed by a flying army under the American general Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Cowpens in January of 1781. And that begins what is known as in the historiography of the American Revolution as the race to the Dan, where the American commander in the Carolinas, Nathaniel Greene, is going to engage in a campaign of exhaustion and essentially run Cornwallis ragged through the western North Carolina. Cornwallis is trying to catch up with Greene before Greene can reach the safety of Virginia. Greene's army is going to cross over the Dan River into Virginia on St. Valentine's Day, in fact, of 1781. And what Greene effectively does after Cowpens is exhaust the British army. Cornwallis is forced to destroy his baggage train. His men are having to live off the land that they've already picked over, land that Greene's men have already picked over. Supplies are low, but just within several days, Greene's going to come back into North Carolina, and on March 15th, 1781, the two sides are going to engage in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. It's a Pyrrhic victory for Cornwallis. He's able to drive Greene from the field, but at the same time, Greene inflicts roughly about 25% casualties, killed, wounded, and missing on Cornwallis's army. And these are men at this point in time that Cornwallis cannot replace. So he's sustained about 25% casualties at Guilford Courthouse. He's still having to deal with supply issues and logistic issues. So what Cornwallis does is he withdraws toward the coast. He's headed toward Cross Creek, or what we know today as Fayetteville, hoping to find supplies there, but the British are unable to take control of the Cape Fear River. It is controlled by Patriot militia, and so he has to march all the way to Wilmington. And by marching to Wilmington, Cornwallis effectively puts himself into a box. He's cut his lines of supply and communication going back to Charleston. He's marched from South Carolina into North Carolina. Even if he were to sail back to Charleston, it would be a signal that he's ending the campaign. He cannot sail to New York. That would be a definite signal that he has been defeated. He cannot sail back to the British base in New York. So what he decides to do is march his army back through North Carolina into Virginia. And Cornwallis does this for two reasons. One, he's trying to salvage a campaign that has gotten drastically away from him. He's lost control of the campaign. And also he believes that if he can pacify Virginia, he's going to cut off supplies coming into Virginia and supplying Greene's army in North Carolina. So as Cornwallis marches his army north in April of 1781, Greene's going to set out to attempt to and ultimately reclaim South Carolina for the Americans.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So you can see this map that we have here that we've been using, and I've been doing my best John Madden impression with, is going to take you all the way through the Carolinas campaigns, which will be the Siege of Charleston. You'll have the Siege of Savannah, and over a 20-month period here in the Deep South, the Patriot forces are actually going to lose 3 armies, either destroyed or captured. Surrendered. So this is going to be not the best theater to fight in if you are part of the Patriot forces. And then eventually this long drawn out series of exhaustive battles will lead these two sides up into Virginia, as Dan so eloquently put it. So this is a very confusing map, as you can see, but there are all kinds of actions that will take place in South Carolina, North Carolina, and then into Virginia. And this is what eventually is going to bring us to the end of the American Revolution. But on the flip side, we have George Washington and the French forces that would come over from France itself, and they're going to start coming up with a new plan, because Washington is going to be up into this area, and Washington's going to be watching New York City. Washington is very focused on the loss at New York, which happened in 1776. He never kind of gets over this loss, and becomes hyper-focused on the British forces who are here. The British forces will use New York as a base of operations. They will launch their campaigns down here towards Charleston, which will eventually fall. Charleston's the 4th largest port in the colonies. And eventually that's what's going to bring the British up through South Carolina, North Carolina, and into Virginia. Now, what Washington is going to start to see, and we'll talk about here, is that there's campaigning taking place down around Richmond, Virginia, Petersburg, Virginia, and then down towards Williamsburg. And he's going to find that Benedict Arnold, the traitor Benedict Arnold, will be down in this area, and then Charles Cornwallis, who's probably the most able field commander in the British Army here in North America, is going to trap himself at Virginia. So what Washington is going to do is eventually make his way down to Virginia. He's also, key to this campaign, going to bring in the French fleet. He actually has to convince the French fleet to come in and help seal off the Chesapeake Bay, and this will bring on what's called the Battle of the Capes as part of this campaign. So the two sides will have, and the British Army under Cornwallis coming up to Yorktown from this area. We'll still have troops under Henry Clinton, British troops in New York, and then we'll have Washington and Rochambeau make their way down from the north. So we have a converging action that will take place around Yorktown. And I want to bring in Mark Malloy, to stop screen sharing here, to start talking a little bit about what we're going to start to see with the Americans coming on to the field here. And then I'll bring on Adam Stilinski to talk about the British who set up their forces here. So for George Washington, in September of 1781, we've decided we're going to start marching our way to Yorktown. What's the thinking here? Is this the last grand stroke, that big battle he's been looking for since Germantown in 1779?
Yeah, no, I don't think, I think you mentioned, Washington hadn't gotten over the fact that New York had been lost in 1776. And that's something that was really personal to Washington. He wanted New York. And I think that his decision, and I think he was led that way by Rochambeau and French, was to to see this opportunity that Cornwallis presented. As you saw, Cornwallis had been campaigning through the Carolinas. A lot of people don't realize that, the beginning bookend of this Southern campaign was the fall of Charleston in 1780. And people don't realize that was the biggest defeat that the American army suffered during the Revolutionary War. Almost 5,000 Continental soldiers were captured in that surrender. Benjamin Lincoln, the general who commanded that army, he would be paroled and returned to the American army. But that was just a huge morale blow to the United States at that time. Then, of course, as Dan had mentioned, you have these battles like Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse that eventually start turning the tide. And Washington's, has to make this decision to abandon his attempt to try and take New York and to march his army down to Virginia. And that is no easy maneuver either. I think people, it's amazing when you read about this march that these guys did, because they, a lot of them did it on foot. At some points they were able to get on water, but a lot of them are marching on foot down from New York down to Virginia through that summer of 1781. And Washington, giving up setting aside his personal desires to retake New York, which probably would have been a bloody mess if he tried to do it, and to agree with Rochambeau and the French and the idea that he was going to focus on Cornwallis's army in Virginia, which looked like an opportunity that they'd be successful at. So instead, he feigns, so he does some, skirmishes so Henry Clinton doesn't know exactly what's going on while he starts moving his army south. As you mentioned, Admiral de Grasse with the French Navy is down in the Caribbean. He's going to come up in Cornwallis, and I'll let Adam talk about the British situation in a minute. But de Grasse is going to come up and really comes right in the nick of time to stop a British fleet from coming to reinforce or help Cornwallis escape. So everything kind of was locking into place right at the right moment. And Washington's army comes down into Virginia. Washington actually stops at his home at Mount Vernon in September 1781. First time he had been home during the entire war. 6 years being away from home, and with the French generals there, lays out some of the last plans for the siege, what would become the siege of Yorktown. They get down to Williamsburg at the end of September 1781. Washington reunites with his Marquis de Lafayette, one of his favorite generals who's operating in Virginia before him. And then they're going to start making their plans to surround Cornwallis's army, just about 8,000 redcoat soldiers there in Yorktown. You can eventually, I don't know if you have a map of Yorktown, but Yorktown sits right on the York River. The British basically are going to set up on both sides of the river. So Washington's going to have to disposition his troops around them. And they're going to break out basically a typical 18th century siege style warfare, where they're going to start building siege trench lines around the British army there. And bringing in their heavy artillery, where they're going to start bombarding Cornwallis's army. But I'll let Adam go ahead and talk a little bit about what's going on in Cornwallis's head and what his options were at this point.
Adam, before you jump in, I'm going to jump in here. You're watching Zoom Goes to History with the American Battlefield Trust. We're talking the Siege of Yorktown, 1781. We're joined by Mark Malloy, Adam Zielinski, Phil Greenwalt, Dan Davis. So please share this with your friends, with your family. I see some people watching on here. We have Andrew Dalton, who will be one of our guests coming up. Harry Smeltzer, who runs a great Civil War blog. We have a good shout out here to Benjamin Martin and how he helped so much in the American victory during the Revolutionary War. As everyone knows, Mel Gibson is the true hero of that movie, The Patriot. But the maps you're looking at are American Battlefield Trust maps here that we'll talk about. And Mark, you brought up a great point about Charleston, and I just want to shout out to our Civil War friends. Charleston, it's where the American Civil War starts. But Charleston is the largest surrender of American troops until you go forward until the Siege of Harper's Ferry in September of 1862. And then the next largest surrender will be actually Corregidor during the Philippines in 1942 during World War II. And then also, we brought up that Cornwallis has an army here. There's also an army up in New York City that's under Henry Clinton, well fortified, as Mark pointed out. Trying to attack there is not the ideal option for the American and French forces. So now we have to come down here to Yorktown, where we have our traditional siege, and we have Charles Cornwallis. So Adam, I'm going to kick it over to you to start talking about Charles Cornwallis and the British here at Yorktown.
Sure. Just to kind of piggyback off of what Mark and Dan both were saying, great introductions on their part. Yeah, the British under Cornwallis, they found themselves in quite a situation in the summer of 1781. As my colleagues pointed out, by this point, Cornwallis's forces were a fraction of what he started with coming out of Charleston, especially after Guilford Courthouse. The morale in the army was very low, and he was in desperate need of supplies. And because of this, he had to stay relatively close to the East Coast. He couldn't venture far inland, despite certain letters that he had written at the time indicating that he was very stubbornly, or however you want to describe it, he was still kind of adamant that he wanted to take the fight to Lafayette and Anthony Wayne. But also he was very cognizant that it possibly could be, the end of his army if he were to do so. So reluctantly, Cornwallis had to stay planted on the coast. And Yorktown actually wasn't his first choice of where he planned to make a siege, if you will. He had another location on one of the lower peninsulas of Virginia, but it was deemed too wide, the waterway, for defenses. And he felt that the French or American, mostly the French Navy, obviously, could come in there and there wouldn't be anything the British could do to stop them. So the York River was narrow enough that they actually could potentially strike the French if they did show up, and also deep enough that the British Navy could still show up and provide supplies and reinforcements if needed. So that is one of the real reasons why Yorktown was chosen as opposed to another site in Virginia. First, fortifications started going up in late July and early August of 1781. These were actually done by, according to Cornwallis's own words in his diaries, these were mostly done by enslaved people who likely escaped from enslavement in Virginia in the South and crossed over into British lines. As we know, a lot of former slaves, under Dunmore's proclamation and other initiatives, they escaped their plantations and joined the British ranks in hope of the British securing their freedom. And in some, we know in some cases, the British promised them that they'd be able to take up arms and serve in the British ranks. But in most cases, they were given, low-meaning work to do. In this case, they were put to work to dig the trenches and fortifications at Yorktown. Nevertheless, the fortifications went up, and by late August, you had somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000, roughly speaking, British troops of various divisions encamped in Yorktown. As we know, there's the two redoubts, 9 and 10, that went up on the southeast peninsula, going, towards the Cape there. Those were to match what Cornwallis was anticipating to be the outer reach of the American and French redoubts when they went up. And it's funny, I stopped only because I was just recently reading Cornwallis's correspondence at the time. And it's also important to note that, as we might know, but others might not know, the relationship between Charles Cornwallis and Henry Clinton at this time was pretty much fractured. After Charleston, they actually still shared a pretty warm friendship with each other. They respected each other, even though they definitely disagreed on battle tactics and strategy from time to time. But by this point in 1781, it seems like their friendship was in many stages irrevocable. And Clinton was a little reluctant to give Cornwallis an independent command, in the South to begin with. And at this point, while he was definitely not reluctant to aid Wallace and reinforce him, Wallace at the same time wanted to go back to Charleston, as I believe Mark pointed out, Dan pointed out. And Clinton said, no, you have to stay put in Virginia. So this seems like this really took Cornwallis by surprise. He actually went into kind of a fit of depression, and he basically was bemoaning himself that how did he ever get in this stage of being stuck behind fortifications and kind of surrounded. And it wasn't until the Americans and French combined forces showed up, and it was on the eve of battle, that Cornwallis seems to have snapped out of his stupor that he was in. But by that point, as we know, it was pretty much too late. So.
Yeah, it's important to remember that Cornwallis is actually, not the primary commander in the Americas. It's Henry Clinton. The two of them go down. They take Charleston. Clinton, like many of the British commanders, it doesn't seem like their hearts are fully into this quelling this revolution. They're definitely doing their duty, but at times, they're like, why are we over here bothering with these people? So it's interesting to see. And I'm going to bring in Phil here to talk a little bit about I'm going to throw a curveball towards him and talk a little bit about engineering. So we're talking about a siege here. The one thing that the American Army is going to lack is going to be trained engineers. We don't have West Point yet here in the United States, so we need to go and bring over some French engineers. We also bring in our most famous probably engineer of the Revolutionary War, and that's Tadeusz Kosciuszko. So Phil, why don't we talk a little bit about what these siege lines are going to look like, siege warfare in the late fall of 1781?
Sure. I was expecting a curveball at some time. The American Army will benefit from French, Polish engineers, especially in the tradition of the siege. They'll use a script by a guy named Vauban from the 18th century or 17th century, excuse me. You build these parallel lines, and you build these lines with perpendicular approaches. So as you come, you move closer and closer incrementally. If you bring up the map there, you'll see how the first Allied siege line is built there, coming from the American Grand Battery and so forth over to the French. And then as they creep closer, you actually have to, that's the hard part, is when you're building these siege lines, be careful with it, because obviously the defense under Cornwallis is not going to just sit quietly by and allow you to come closer and closer. So there are some soirees out by the British to disrupt these lines, but it is a tactic. It's something you can't rush. You've got to prepare the front line, bring up the support and supplies by these engineers, start carving another line, a zigzag approach, so you can get to a second line. Then you can start, the words escaping me, but they did bundle together sticks and so forth to kind of create these rolling defenses to support the engineers as they move closer to Yorktown. As they did, of course, you bring up the artillery. You can see the French artillery camped in behind. One of the things that you need in a siege is a great logistics. And so luckily for the Americans, they have the city of, or the town of Williamsburg, I guess you can call it a city, the colonial capital at the time, where they're able to offload things and bring them up onto the peninsula. He also, at the same time, constructing siege lines on the other side and Gloucester Point, one of the forgotten aspects of the Yorktown campaign. You see Tarleton's name over there. Some of those earthworks are still very, very impressive. They're actually improved upon in this American Civil War. So as they approach, of course, and then you bring up the artillery so you can bring it in closer to the British lines. And actually, I think it's Washington who will actually fire the first gun into the British. One of the things that helped the American cause is actually kind of the lack of initiative shown by Cornwallis during the summer and fall to really kind of build these his own defensive siege lines. And so eventually what will need to happen is on the night of October 14th, 1781, you see Redoubt 9 and 10 down on the coast there would need to be captured by joint American French forces to complete that second siege line. And that's really the ending of the siege. Once that's there, the Americans can actually fire into the town, fire almost the whole breadth of the British line. And so it is American leadership, but it's French and Polish engineering might using some original tracks from centuries before to complete a traditional siege, giving the Americans the chance to ensconce Cornwallis or Yorktown.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so what you're looking at here is, again, me playing John Madden, but this gives you an idea of what the siege lines would look like. And this really isn't a full-on siege because the American lines don't fully go all the way around the British lines. So what you would have is the Americans focusing on one portion of the line. You also see a redoubt to the north called Fusiliers Redoubt, which will be attacked at one point throughout the siege. And you'll have a line of what's supposed to be called a circumvallation. That will be your line that starts to envelop this siege. And then you'll have a second line, which the Americans do start to build, called countervallation, which is in case somebody comes here to try to save Cornwallis's bacon, pull it out of the fire. And as Phil pointed out, these tactics are designed in the 16 and early 1700s by a guy named Sebastian Vauban, who is Louis XIV's personal engineer, and he built all kinds of fortifications throughout France and Belgium, which were used all the way up through the World Wars because he was the guy. Vauban is really good at what he does. And you're on Zoom Goes the History. I'm Kris White with the American Battlefield Trust. We're joined today by Mark Malloy, Adam Zielinski, Phil Greenwald, Dan Davis. We're talking the Siege of Yorktown here in 1781, which to many people was the end of the American Revolution. So what I'm going to do is clear off my drawings here. Let's talk a minute about the French batteries and the American batteries. As Phil mentioned, they're going to start bombarding not only the British lines, but the small town of Yorktown. If you go to Yorktown today, some of the homes have, are marked by the cannonballs that hit them. Some of them have fake ones in them showing where they may or may not have been hit. But does anybody want to talk for a minute about the utilization of these batteries and how they're going to bombard Cornwallis and maybe a cave that Cornwallis's men would be using at the time? Nobody wants to talk artillery? Go on, Mark. I can see you up there.
Yeah, the number of guns, and I don't know them off the top of my head as big as they were, but they had heavy artillery that they would have been bombarding on the British lines. And yeah, a lot of the ones are going to go into the town. In fact, there's a story too. You see the Nelson house is marked there. And I believe it's Thomas Nelson. He's actually in the American Army at that time, part of the Virginia militia. And he actually, I forget the exact story behind it, but I don't know if he fires the cannon himself or orders it to be fired onto his own house, showing you what he's willing to sacrifice in order to eventually bring the retreat of the British Army or the surrender of them. But yeah, so they're going to bombard on it from those lines. And as Phil was mentioning, that's why it's so important about, you see those two redoubts there, 9 and 10. That's why those are so important to capture, because you can see how close they are to the actual British lines. And, they had, big cannons that could fire into the British lines or over them. But in order to get into their lines to do some sort of damage on the actual British troops that are there, they would have mortars. They could fire up and over the actual British entrenchments. And once they get into redoubts 9 and 10, then they're going to be able to just blast Cornwallis's lines and be able to affect, casualties on his soldiers. So that's why it was so important to capture those. And of course, they used light infantry to actually capture redoubts 9 and 10. And they did that in a night assault using nothing but bayonets and unloaded muskets. And so that was really important. That was some of the last hand-to-hand combat of this campaign. And you mentioned the cave. What were the British doing? There's if you go down to Yorktown today and you go down along the beach, there's a cave, and they call it Cornwallis's cave, that he hid out in the cave during the bombardment. I think that's probably local lore. They probably were using it in some way to protect things, but Cornwallis probably had his headquarters somewhere else, not inside the cave. But that was kind of local lore that built up around that. But the British, and they're not just sitting there taking this; they're firing back at the Americans the whole way. And like you noticed, you can see Tarleton's up there in Gloucester Point. They're going to make an attempt in October 1781 to break out through that side. And there's a small action there in Gloucester called the Battle of the Hook. where it's just the British against some Virginia militia and some French cavalry. The Americans are victorious, and Charleston's not able to escape that way. It's still commemorated, though. They often do a reenactment of the Battle of the Hook there in Gloucester. And as Phil mentioned, the earthworks over there, there's still a lot of archaeological discoveries of the remnants of the actual earthworks from that time period. But yeah, no, they were using all of this different types of artillery trying to blast through. But once the Americans get those redoubts so close, it's just a matter of time. And so Cornwallis is not shortly, just 3 days after that, is going to write to Washington and say he's surrendering his posts at York and Gloucester.
So, Mark, let's. I think we need to back up for a second here and talk about that assault on redoubts 9 and 10. So I'm going to bring the map back up just real fast, so we have to work off of it. But what's happening is I have the wrong tab open here. And there we go. Okay, so what's happening is, we have the slow strangulation going on. We have the French fleet that are going to be out strangling off the waterways. The British will try to break out, but it's like you said, it doesn't work. Then we're going to have the siege lines slowly creeping closer and closer, as Phil pointed out. And now we have these advanced redoubts. We have the Fusiliers redoubt to the north. We have the redoubts 9 and 10 to the south. So that would, once you take these advanced outposts, you're either going to be able to put your third siege line up against the British. The idea actually at the time was to put a third siege line, and you would put ramps, earthen ramps, that would lead you right up into the British lines. It's not the best thing to do, and that's usually the textbook tactics to use, but what the Americans are going to try to do, and the French are going to try to take these two advanced redoubts. And Mark, you wrote a great article for Hallowed Ground magazine talking about this, and it involves two of the most famous personalities to partake in the Yorktown siege. Can you talk about those two?
Oh yeah, so I mean, it's a great story. Fans of Hamilton, the musical. I mean, there's a whole song dedicated to this moment. Because Alexander Hamilton is going to be involved in this. You can sort of tell that I think he understood that this was one of the last great actions of the war, and he wanted to make sure he had his opportunity to partake in some of the glory. And so he's going to he's going to request to lead the assault. So there's going to be two redoubts there, like I said, 9 and 10. And Washington's going to divide it up to the French and the Americans. The French are going to take redoubt 9. The Americans are going to be able to take redoubt 10. And again, these are going to be night assaults. There's going to be no muskets. It's just going to be bayonets. Go in, get over the ramparts as quickly as possible, take those positions, and immediately dispatch any of the enemy, capture them. And so Washington's going to, like I said, give the French their opportunity, but and the commander of the American column is going to be Marquis de Lafayette. And Marquis de Lafayette's going to actually appoint one of his French officers to lead the Americans forward. And Hamilton doesn't like this, so he appeals to Lafayette. Lafayette says, tough luck. So Hamilton's going to go straight to Washington and say, I want command. So Washington's going to acquiesce with Hamilton, tell Lafayette to put Hamilton in charge. So Hamilton's going to lead one of the American columns, and you're going to have the French taking redoubt 9. And they both go forward. Of course, the British, it's dark. They do see them as they start getting closer. And they're going to rush in there. This is American light infantry, so they've been kind of handpicked from the American units. Some of the best they have go in there. There's another famous guy, Henry Lawrence, who's a commander. He's going to take some troops to go around the rear of Redoubt 10, but it's going to be crazy for a few minutes, where it's going to be hand-to-hand combat once the Americans get up over into Redoubt 10. And after a few casualties, it wasn't extremely bloody, but there were dozens of people killed and wounded. The Americans are going to be successful in taking Redoubt 10, and it's a little bit bloodier, but shortly thereafter, the French secure Redoubt 9, and that ends that one episode. But yeah, Hamilton is. There's actually a story that he gets there. He's actually short, so he can't get up through the up over the rampart, and he has to have two guys lift him up to get up over there. Don't know if that's true or not. But he does, the Americans do get up over there, and it secures for Hamilton what he wanted, the military glory. Lafayette also gets his credit for being in charge of the American troops there. And ultimately it's Washington who is successful in this venture, and that's going to speed. Like I said, it was 3 days after that the British are going to be forced to surrender.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This is Zoom Goes to History, talking the Siege of Yorktown here, 1781. George Washington and Rochambeau taking on Charles Cornwallis. You're joined by Mark Malloy, Adam Zielinski, Phil Greenwald, Dan Davis, and we're actually looking at one of the virtual tours that we have on the battlefields.org website. Dan actually helped to design these. Dan, we're looking here at the Yorktown battlefield. We're looking in the vicinity, not at Redoubts 9 and 10. Redoubts 10 actually is in the York River today, and Redoubt 9 is been rebuilt. So we have these actually most of the works have been rebuilt. We actually are looking at some of the earthworks here at Yorktown. Dan, is there anything you want to say about the siege as it's about to start to come to an end and what we're looking at here?
Yeah, just to sort of underscore what Mark mentioned a few minutes ago, the capture of Redoubts 9 and 10 is really the climactic moment of the siege. It's going to allow the Americans, as Kris mentioned to a little bit earlier, to begin construction or finish construction on a second line. They're inching ever closer to Cornwallis's works, but when they take those two redoubts, they have now the ability, one, to fire point blank into the British lines, and they also have a staging area for the potential final assault on Cornwallis's position. And within hours after capturing those redoubts, the Americans have mounted artillery in those captured redoubts, and they're starting to bombard Cornwallis's line from his former redoubts. And it really, their capture really limits Cornwallis's options after that.
Jump in real quick here. Just an interesting point is that actually the British will actually outnumber the American French forces in amount of artillery present or available. It's just that they don't either have the manpower or the ability to continue to operate them. Because at the heyday of the climax of the siege, the Americans are firing about 1,500 rounds per day into the British lines, which is more than one round a minute. So so they can't replace stuff. They can't get to the fire back, and the amount of fire on the British is tremendous. So I just wanted to jump that in following what Mark and Dan spoke about and you caught me when I was trying to share some of this on my own, so I didn't get a chance to jump in with the artillery. So I figured before we moved on, just to mention that at the point of the siege, 1,500 rounds per day on average is what's being fired by the Americans. An amazing amount of firepower for the British to hunker down and try to respond with.
Yeah, and I'll tag on real quick to what Phil mentioned. Cornwallis does not bring much artillery with him to Virginia. He's having to cannibalize guns off of British ships and put them in the front line. Meanwhile, there is the Americans and French essentially have an endless supply of artillery. On the map that Kris was showing, you'll see, and you can visit these areas today on the Yorktown battlefield, the French artillery encampment, or the French artillery park, the American artillery park. These are essentially areas that the armies portioned off behind the lines, where the excess artillery that were not being used in the lines would be stored, along with tools necessary, men necessary to fix the guns if they needed to be repaired. There are forges there, extra supplies such as wheels for the gun carriages are kept there. And so they are constantly, the French and Americans are constantly cycling guns off of the line, and should they need to be repaired, or they just have almost an endless supply of not only artillery, but artillery rounds to pound Cornwallis.
That's a great point to make there, Dan, because and you can access a lot of these areas today because through the National Park Service, through the driving tour route, you can actually go back to these different encampments, which will eventually lead you to Surrender Field, which we'll talk about next. Adam, I think you had something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what everybody's saying. It's great. I wanted to touch on I think what Mark was saying about Cornwallis hiding underground. I actually did read a piece from a British officer who confirmed that he actually was hiding underground. So whether it was in the cave or whether it was in the belly of some building, as we're all saying, the American bombardment was so intense that it was, it was for safety reasons, obviously. So, yeah, apparently he was underground at some point. But through all of this, though, Cornwallis still maintains that British arrogance, if you will, that all of the British commanders showed from, time and time again throughout the entire war. Up until Redoubts 9 and 10 were taken, Cornwallis was still showing that British stiff upper lip confidence that it was going to work out, And we know this because he was under the assumption of two things. One, that Admiral Graves was going to return with the British Navy to bring him supplies. Now, after the Battle of the Capes, we know Graves went back to New York to fix his ships and all that. And at that point, Clinton was actually putting together more troops and supplies to bring back to Cornwallis at Yorktown. So Cornwallis at this point was still under the assumption that the British were going to come back at some point and reinforce him. So he, going into the battle, even though he's still being, bombarded with all the American and French artillery, his correspondence shows that he still is relatively confident that he's going to pull out of this somehow. And then the second point is, as somebody mentioned, there was an attempt to possibly break out of Yorktown and go to Gloucester and rendezvous with Tarleton's men. Now, I've read it wasn't, I know there was a skirmish there, but I know also that there was weather conditions that actually prevented this from going off. And as many times as Washington prevailed because of weather, it seems in this case, Cornwallis actually was prevented from possibly breaking out because of weather. And then after that, and then of course, he received correspondence that there was no way the British were going to be able to leave New York until October 19th, which coincidentally is the day he surrendered. Once he received correspondence that the British were not going to be able to leave New York to reinforce him, that's when he starts accepting the inevitable that he was in real trouble. And then, of course, once the redoubts were both taken, it was inevitable at this point. So,
yeah. So let's wrap up here by talking, quickly about the surrender. So essentially the redoubts are going to fall, and now the Americans and French are creeping closer. The artillery bombardment is actually hitting Cornwallis's headquarters at the Nelson House. If he's actually there or not is debatable. As Mark said, he may not have been there. As Adam said, he might have been in the cave. And I do know that the cave turns into, and you can go actually see the cave today. Cornwallis's cave is in Yorktown. It's down by the Yorktown beach, and Union soldiers in 1862 would go there to visit it. There's photographs and sketches from that area because there's a second siege during the American Civil War in April into May of 1862, and you'll have Confederates there, you'll have Union forces there, and this is the first time some of these guys actually get away from their homes and actually take a mini vacation during the war and explore the area. But in late or mid-October of 1781, you're Charles Cornwallis, you find out Clinton is not going to be able to come down here and save your bacon. And now it's your redoubts have fallen. What is the next steps for Rochambeau and Washington? Who's going to start the surrender, or at least to suggest that Cornwallis should surrender? Anybody want to take that?
I mean, I think, there is the writing on the wall with the redoubts falling, and when the flag of truce comes out, the negotiations will take place. It takes actually a few days. It's there's two big sticking points. The first for the surrender negotiations that do take place, and you can go. I think the house is preserved by the National Park Service. It's on the map that Kris had shared prior. And it'll be hammered out over a few days because there is the sticking points of, we harking back to what Dan and Mark talked about, that siege of Charleston, the surrender of the American forces there. They're not given the honors of war when they capitulate there. And so will that be afforded to Cornwallis's troops here in Yorktown? And the second thing is that Adam alluded to that former enslaved labor had helped build the intrenchments, while a lot of loyalists and so forth had come to actually seek shelter with Cornwallis's troops as well. So what will happen to the Loyalist population? So when both of those decisions are finally hammered out over those few days, the British will actually march out onto a field to surrender their forces. And one of the ironies about it is that the Americans are kind of secluded from that afterwards. It's more of a when the British and French get together for the dinner, it's more of an officer gentleman camaraderie type thing. But obviously, one of the biggest instances at the surrender is when Washington allows Lincoln, his second in command, to accept the sword of Charles O'Hara, the second in command of Lord Cornwallis at the surrender. I'll leave it up to Adam and other ones to say whether was Cornwallis really sick or feeling under the weather, or did he just not want the infamy of surrendering? So, but yeah, it will be those two main sticking points that have to be hammered out. What to do with? Do they get the honor of surrendering with their colors and so forth, and also the Loyalists, the two sticking points that hold up the procedures for a few days, the negotiations.
Yeah, and so what will end up happening is that on October 19th, the two sides will come out and into what we call the surrender field today. And this is a painting by John Trumbull that shows the surrender. And what you're seeing in the center is sitting on the horse is Benjamin Lincoln. And he's looking down to Charles O'Hara, who is Phil said, or these are the two respective commanders, the second in commands of both armies. George Washington, you see off to the right-hand side, refuses to accept the surrender from O'Hara because he's not of equal rank. And that comes up a lot in Washington's life. And I think we'll talk a lot about that tonight when we talk about George Washington. If you join us for Zoom Goes the History there. Trumbull's painting is also showing in the background the Nelson House, which is the headquarters of Charles Cornwallis here. But I think the important thing to remember as well, we're not just seeing British soldiers surrendering here, we're seeing a good deal of Hessian soldiers also will be surrendering. This is a mixed army on both sides. We have French and we have Americans, we have British and we have German mercenaries. So does anybody want to touch on that quickly before we wrap up?
Yeah, I was going to also mention, before O'Hara offers his sword to Washington, Washington declines and says, give it to Lincoln. O'Hara actually wanted to give it to Rochambeau in the French army, thinking that they were more their enemies rather than the Americans. And, he defers and says, give it to Washington, and Washington says, give it to Lincoln. So just kind of shows you the power dynamics going on at the time. As you mentioned, Hessians, there's a large contingent of Hessians in Cornwallis's army. The Hessians were some of the most feared European soldiers in the Revolutionary War. A lot of them, we call them mercenaries because they were hired soldiers, but it was really the princes of the principalities over in Germany that were collecting the money. The Hessians were paid soldiers, but they were kind of forced into the army often. It was almost like against their will, and then they were pushed and sent, wherever the prince told them to go. So a lot of them end up here in America, and actually a lot of them, are going to desert, and many of them are going to, blend into the American countryside. And a lot of people today can trace ancestries back to actual Hessian soldiers, because there's a large German, immigrant group here in America already, and so they could kind of work their way in. There would be nothing worse than going back to your home country in defeat as a Hessian soldier. So that would have been pretty bad. So, some of the British, it wasn't just Hessian, it wasn't just red-coated British soldiers, but there were German soldiers. And so, it was really a whole, very multicultural, all these different groups that were involved in this one campaign.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Mark, with the Hessians who actually stay behind, because a lot of these guys, like you said, the princes of Hesse and Kessel will get the money, but these guys come over here and they're soldiers of fortune after this. This is how they're going to build their wealth. Maybe looting and plundering while they're here, not so much that their payment. And then they kind of fall in love with the idea of staying here in what becomes the United States. So the October 19th, 1781, the Revolutionary War ends that exact day, correct?
No.
Exactly. So we still have 2 years to go almost before the Treaty of Paris is going to be signed. Anybody want to kind of fill in what happens here in the intervening years between 1781 and 83, whenever the Treaty of Paris is signed, which officially ends the war?
I'll take a mild stab at it.
Go for it.
Sure. So as we alluded to, well, first I was going to say, I don't think Cornwallis was sick. Let's get that on the table. I don't think he was sick. I think he was still reeling from Washington humiliating him after Trenton leading into Princeton. So I think he had a beef there. But anyway, going into the events right after Yorktown, the British soldiers were paroled. They were sent back to New York, and a majority of them under Clinton's command remained in New York in the vicinity until November of 1783. That is when the bulk of the forces moved out and went back to England. But just as it was just alluded to with the Hessian soldiers, it's also true that there was a large percentage of British soldiers too that deserted and stayed in America for pretty much the same reason, because we spoke a common language. It wasn't very hard for British soldiers, especially among the regulars who, let's face it, life in the British Army was not that great. And they probably saw opportunity everywhere in the United States, and they stayed too. I don't know the exact numbers, but I have read various numbers that show that there are sizable portions of the British Army that did desert and stay in the United States following the war. Anyway, but at the same time in 1782, overseas we have the Treaty of Paris delegation with John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, working it out with their counterparts in both the French and British governments. But at the same time, as we just all kind of giggled at, Yorktown in 1781 does not signal the end of hostilities in the United States. You have severe partisan bickering, and not just bickering, but bloodshed happening still in the Carolina backcountry. Even in New Jersey, my home state, there's various reports of partisan warfare going back and forth because, in many ways, the American Revolution was a civil war. You had the population divided at all times of the war. And as we all know, your loyalties pretty much laid with whatever army was marching through town at the time. So for a lot of the citizens, survival was key amongst loyalties. So when the war was still trying to be ironed out, there was no uncertainty that the war was actually going to end. And if you read George Washington, which I'm sure we all have, his correspondence showed there is an extreme delicacy to the peace negotiations. There's an extreme delicacy to maintaining discipline in the Continental Army, because at this point, the Army's not really engaged in any major operations. So he has to, the great challenge, especially in late 82, leading into 1783, is how to maintain discipline in the Army. And we see that unravel almost to disastrous effect at Newburgh with the Newburgh conspiracy. And, I'm sure we'll touch on that later tonight with Washington, but, that right there is the case where the entire American cause, the reason for American independence and the reason for fighting the war, it almost came to nothing. It was almost destroyed by an act of mutiny by Washington's officers. So the war was by no means over by 1781. In many ways, the war actually went on, just it took on new perilous instances that had to be dealt with. And so no, it did not end with Yorktown.
And it's also a global war, so there's naval conflicts going on with the French all around the world, and so there's still other powers. But here in the United States, there's some small skirmishes. And I'll point out one of the famous people we mentioned at Redoubt 10 was Henry Lawrence, son of the president of the Continental Congress. is in a very small skirmish down in South Carolina and is leading a small group of troops, and he's shot in the head and killed instantly, which is a real devastating loss to Washington personally and Hamilton especially. And so you just see like this, it seems like almost useless bloodshed during those last intervening years while there's a stalemate up around New York. Clinton's still sitting there. But Lord North, when he first heard about the surrender of Cornwallis's army, he said, cried out, "Oh God, it was all over." So I think both sides realized the writing was on the wall after Yorktown, but there was all these things that had to be figured out in those intervening years before British troops. And then once the treaty is signed, then you have to have the British troops leave. And when the Americans come into New York City in November 1783, it was a day that was celebrated for hundreds of years after that, called Evacuation Day. Same thing in Charleston down in December 1782 is when the British troops finally leave. Both those days, that was a big thing when British soldiers finally left American cities. And like you said, it's 2 years after, more than that, after the British lose at Yorktown. So yeah, Yorktown is not the end, but is definitely, the writing was on the wall after that.
Yeah, and Washington loses his stepson to illness during the Yorktown.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Yeah, John Parke Custis, he dies, but his son, who was just born, was George Washington Parke Custis, who will eventually go on to be the father-in-law of Robert E. Lee. He actually writes down that a couple days after the surrender, Cornwallis comes and dines with Washington. So I guess he got over his sickness by then. And then during the dinner, Cornwallis has raised a glass and says, "Your feats and your exploits on the Potomac can only, or on the Chesapeake Bay, can only be rivaled by your exploits on the Delaware River." Right. He was alluding to Washington's earlier victories at Trenton and Princeton. So just a neat little, but yeah, the personal suffering for Washington, losing his stepson, John Parke Custis, there right after the Battle of Yorktown, must have been difficult for him for sure.
Yeah, and when New York's finally evacuated Washington, because to me it always sticks out is that Washington was always focused on New York, and even after his army is going home, he's going to take 800 guys and march down through New York City to kind of get the thumb at the nose at the British that he finally got the city back that he had lost in 1776.